Hi everyone, my name is Jessica and I'm going to be sharing some information from chapter 12 in our textbook, and it's about natural resources for subsistence in Alaska, and we're going to cover the concepts, policies, and law. And there's not a particular reason why I decided to cover this chapter, although I have been to Alaska and it's one of the most beautiful places I have been, seeing grizzlies and breaching whales and just miles long of glaciers. It's just a really cool place to visit, and I recommend checking it out if you haven't. But let's get into it. So an overview of what I'm going to cover in this lecture, I want to give a background about the history of subsistence in Alaska and how it's administered today between the federal and the state government, and how that's broken up into regional councils, and then the Federal Subsistence Board, and then what the current regulations are with that. And then after that, I'm going to dive into the actual components of the subsistence program and how residents can become eligible, how subsistence was traditionally used, priority, and then current harvest regulations. I'm also going to talk about special circumstances and additions, as well as law enforcement, the consultation of current tribes in Alaska, and then the ongoing efforts of research and monitoring programs in Alaska focused on subsistence fisheries and wildlife. So before European settlement, all Alaska Natives relied on resources of the land and the water. But then as North America began to grow and develop roads and river transportation and other means of transport, we then become more dependent on the mass production of food, like in grocery stores. But traditionally and historically, Alaskans still have the original way of life for 90% of the land currently and 17% of the people. And so subsistence harvesting for food is mostly fish, and a lot of this is Chinook salmon, but they also do hunt for land mammals, marine mammals, birds, and plants as well. So subsistence hunting can have some health benefits. This can be in the form of nutrients, fatty acids, antioxidants, calories, proteins, and protection against general diseases like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and general health of mothers and babies in nutrition. Subsistence resources are important to community health, especially self-determination when hunting and harvesting and fishing, as well as cultural, social, and the overall health of Alaskan Natives. So I've included this brief video that I encourage you to check out. So today, just as in the past, many Alaskans have lived off the land where they're relying on fish, wildlife, and other wild resources. And Alaskan Natives have used these subsistence resources for food, for shelter, for clothing, transportation, craft, and just trade for thousands of years before European settlement even. And subsistence, in all it entails, it's really critical to sustaining both the physical and the spiritual culture of Alaska Native people, because it's an important tradition, even for non-natives as well. So I encourage you to check out this short video. It's relatively brief. It's posted by the National Park Service, Denali in Alaska. And it's just an insight of what subsistence farming and tradition looks like today in regards to fisheries in Alaska. So a little bit about the history and the beginning of subsistence use. So in the 1960s, there was a large quantity of oil discovered on the north slope of the Brooks Mountain Range. And they wanted to transport the oil to a port without ice, but that would require an 800-mile-long pipeline to be installed. So the Alaskan Native Claims Settlement Act was created, and this wasn't creating reservations, but it's actually a combined monetary and land settlement between the natives and the government. And this was comprised of 13 Alaskan Native regions, and then 200 villages for profit corporations were also created. So that totaled about 12% of the state. And the overall purpose was to provide an economic value to the communities and the tribes, and a direct benefit to the shareholders and the source of subsistence food through this pipeline. And the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act didn't actually provide the subsistence for the natives, but that came along later with the Alaska National Interest Land Conservation Act, which I'm going to be referring to as NCILCA. And there's three components of NCILCA and this act and how it was made. They recognize that subsistence for natives is really essential to cultural existence and reflecting of their tradition. It's also because there might not be any alternatives to replace food supplies. So subsistence harvesting and fishing is quite necessary. And NCILCA also created an administrative structure that was established. So now Alaskan residents have a role in the management of the fish and wildlife resources in the area. And this really allowed the state of Alaska to implement subsistence priority for rural Alaskans across the federal lands and in the state. The state provides a subsistence harvest priority for all the residents currently. So in NCILCA, the state specified that the users for which the subsistence use applied to those in rural areas, but the consistency between the state and the federal definition of what users are ended in the decision of McDowell and the state of Alaska. And in this, they found the priority for rural residents to be unconstitutional because the Constitution generally states that we're providing equal access to wildlife for all citizens, regardless of where they live and where they're from. So the state considered amending the legislature to include a rural priority in NCILCA, but it did not in the end. So in 1990, the federal government actually withdrew the authority to manage subsistence on federal lands in Alaska. And then that's what led to the Federal Subsistence Management Program, which was established and is being used currently today. So administering subsistence priority, it's a combination between state and federal government management. But to specify, the state manages state, private, federal lands and federal lands and water, whereas the federal government only manages the federal lands and water for the rural residents exclusively. And so the states and the state and the feds manage for the priority of subsistence use in a bottom-up structure of management, where they're considering the needs of rural residents and also being respectful of others' opinions. And I also wanted to point out the definition of subsistence by NCILCA, which is the customary and traditional uses by rural Alaskan residents of wild renewable resources for direct personal or family consumption as food, shelter, fuel, clothing, tools, or transportation. So kind of breaking this down, then they created the regional advisory councils. So NCILCA's Federal Subsistence Management Program is a shared joint authority between the Department of the Interior and the Department of Ag. And their primary responsibility is for implementing the provisions for subsistence. And this can be in national parks and preserves, and monuments, national wildlife refuges, and BLM lands. And so to encourage people to be active in this, they created 10 regional advisory councils. And this was an area for opinions and recommendations to be shared. So there was public forums and public hearings held where rural residents from Alaska could attend and share their knowledge and what they recommend for fish and wildlife regulations. And I wanted to emphasize that this really enabled the rural residents to have a role in the management of the fisheries and wildlife for subsistence use in the area. And then the Federal Subsistence Board is responsible primarily for promoting the regulations around subsistence and regulating the take of fish and game and fish and wildlife. And there's 5 agencies involved in this in Alaska, which is Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, National Park Service, Bureau of Indian Affairs, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I've kind of covered what subsistence program is overall and the direction of the state and the federal government in this. So now I kind of want to get into the nitty-gritty components of what the subsistence program is for the current residents of Alaska. So there's an eligibility portion. All Alaska rural residents are considered eligible, but ANSILCA doesn't really define what rural means. So in this report, it was, however, identified where there are 4 cities as rural and 5 communities as non-rural. But without the determination, the rural community would not really have the ability to take fish and wildlife under the regulations. So we actually use that report's guidelines to develop, or the board uses those guidelines to develop another guideline for the boundaries of non-rural and rural areas. And it's also acknowledging the tradition of subsistence use. The Federal Subsistence Board determined which fish stocks and wildlife had traditionally been used for subsistence, and by speaking to the natives and the locals and seeing what they knew from the history and what they're recommending to be managed in the future. So in this program, there are regulations that the board annually invites changes to. And in these proposals, the board analyzes them on 3 main categories. They're looking for 3 things to implement these recommendations. One of them being evidence. So the recommendation must provide substantial evidence behind that. So it has to be scientific. Second, it has to also abide by principles of conservation. So they can't violate recognized general principles of conservation. And lastly, subsistence needs. It can't be detrimental to the satisfaction of the subsistence needs for the residents. And so once these recommendations are analyzed and approved, the final regulations are then published in the Federal Register, which I wanted to highlight here. So the Federal Register is a daily journal of the government, and I have an article, which is the management regulations for public lands in the next few years and the take of wildlife regulations. And I've attached this here and I encourage you to take a look at it. This one stood out to me because it was published so recently, and looking through the Federal Register, there's quite a few recent publications, which is actually encouraging because it means that they're holding these forums with the residents of Alaska to get their opinions. So this final rule of the recommendations establishes regulations for season, harvest limits, and then methods and means related to the take of wildlife for subsistence use in Alaska. The Federal Subsistence Board completes the process by revising the hunting and trapping regulations in the even number of years, and then the fishing and shellfish regulation in the odd number of years. The board also addresses customary and traditional use determinations throughout the cycle, revising the customary and traditional use determinations for wildlife, the general regulations, and a deferred proposal from the fish. So I encourage you to check that out. I've linked that here. And so there also has been some additions and special circumstances to the Federal Subsistence Management Program. One of them being allowance for cultural and educational harvest. Another is the ability of one person to designate another to harvest for them. And kind of along those similar lines, allowance of representatives of a community to harvest for the entire community. As well as ability to trade limited amounts of fish and wildlife for cash. And lastly, the board can take action for conservation purposes if they deem necessary. So these are all special circumstances that are kind of additions and exceptions to the general regulations of the subsistence program. So law enforcement also plays a role in this. They are ensuring that rural residents are qualified and are allowed to harvest, and that the regulations in general are being obeyed. And this may mean that licenses and harvest reports are required of the residents. I also want to note that consultation of the tribes is recognized. Bill Clinton signed an executive order that states that the Subsistence Board does consult with the federal tribes and ANSCA corporations. And they just wanted to recognize that the tribes are spiritually, physically, culturally, historically connected to the land, the wildlife, and the waters. So research and monitoring is also a large part of this program. And it's continuing on in the future too. So Congress directs the board to research fish and wildlife subsistence use and to consult with the residents. And the majority of the funding for the research is for fisheries research and fisheries monitoring programs, which include harvest monitoring, traditional ecological knowledge, stock status, and trends. And all of this can provide information about fish runs, life history, geographic distributions, genetic stock identification, etc. And there's current emphasis on monitoring resource changes related to climate change and what that looks like in the next few years. So a little bit more about the research and monitoring, since I think this is an important part of the program. The 25 years of subsistence research showed the importance of local ground-based regulation. And again, this is really emphasizing the bottom-up management in this, where the rural residents have the recommendations and the say in what they want to see in the regulations, and that gets passed up to the federal and the state that then makes these into current active legislature and the recommendations. In just 15 years, the federal government spent over $100 million to fund 431 subsistence projects. I have attached, or I've linked an annual report from Alaska Fish and Game from 2019 about the Chinook salmon gear harvest and between gear and the general harvest. And I'd encourage you to take a look at it. It notes the salmon harvest for Southeast Alaska in 2019 at about 140,000 fish. And so they're recommending for the future a 2% reduction, so that can serve as a buffer to avoid exceeding the limit of fish. And I also pulled out a table from this report that I found interesting, and it shows that the majority of the salmon allocations have been from trolling harvest gear. So I've attached that here, so I encourage you to go check that out. And to wrap this up, in this lecture, I talked about the subsistence management in Alaska and how it uses a ground up model, starting with the rural residents first. And this really provides the residents a role in the regulation development and how it affects them in the subsistence program. They also want to meet the needs of traditional harvest and recognize that this was a traditional use and that they still like to use it today. And then that the state and the federal subsistence programs are relatively similar, although there's one big distinction, and that's that the state of Alaska harvest priority for all residents on most land, on private, on federal, on public land, private, state, and federal land. And then the difference is that the federal priority for rural residents is solely on federal public land for rural residents. And then again, this is a ground up management, which includes eligibility determination, local involvement, permitting, and current research and monitoring to get estimates of what that looks like for the future. And then again, they are consulting with the current residents and hearing them out for their recommendations. Here are my questions. 1, what makes the majority of subsistence food used by Alaska Natives? 2, describe the difference between state and federal management of subsistence priority. And then 3, what is the backbone for bottom-up management system, and explain how this functions. And then I've also included the literature cited here with our textbook chapter 12. And that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed, and I really look forward to the discussion for this week. I will talk to you all soon. Bye-bye.